I just finished Wuthering Waves' latest story update, and instead of going to sleep, I opened a blank document and started writing. Not because I needed to get the video out quickly. This one isn't even coming out for another couple of days, but because I didn't trust myself to remember this feeling if I waited too long. I played enough gacha stories to know how this usually goes. I enjoy the update, I note a few high and lows, and then I file it away until the next one drops. Even when a story is solid, it rarely lingers in a way that demands immediate reflection. This one did. What surprised me wasn't just that it was well written or that certain scenes landed emotionally, it was how complete it felt, how deliberate, how much of it seemed to know exactly what it was doing and why. By the time I reached the end, I realized I wasn't thinking about individual moments anymore. I was thinking about the update as a whole and how far it had gone beyond what I expected this story to be capable of. So before breaking down the mechanics of why it works, I want to start with an honest reaction. The part that hits first, before analysis had the chance to smooth it out. Because this wasn't just a strong update, it felt like a turning point. One of the things that surprised me the most in this update actually hits immediately. The protagonist. For whatever reason, Kuro fully voiced them this time. And when I say fully voiced, I mean constantly, not just a line here and there. And the moment that started, it was impossible not to notice how much that changes everything. Hearing the protagonist speak, actually speak, suddenly gives them weight, personality, presence. You can feel how much more expressive they are just through voice alone. This is exactly what the usual self-insert gacha protagonist lacks. And honestly, I loved every moment of it. At the start of the update, this felt like the big thing. I kept thinking, okay, this alone already makes the story better. But by the time I reached the end, it wasn't even the biggest surprise anymore. That's how strong the rest of the writing was. I don't know what happened between 3.0 and 3.1, maybe the writers changed, maybe the direction shifted, I genuinely don't know. But the story is levels above what Kuro has done before, not just for Wuthering Waves, but compared to most gacha storytelling in general. For the first time, it felt like they weren't afraid to actually engage with the protagonist as a character. We learn about their past, we learn who they are, we finally get answers to things that were rushed, ignored, or barely acknowledged before. Their memories, their relationships, their place in the world. And the important part, none of it felt rushed, none of it felt padded, it just fits. Everything falls into place naturally. And then there's Aemeath. This is where it goes from great to holy shit. I already said in my earlier video that if Kuro could live up to the expectations they were setting up with her promotional material, not just for her but for the main story, then this update could be something special. They didn't just meet those expectations, they completely overturned them. Everything I thought I understood about Aemeath from the promos, wrong, and wrong in the best possible way. The way Kuro presented her beforehand versus how she's actually written in the story feels intentional, careful, almost deceptive, but not in a cheap way. It's a genuinely smart move, and calling her well written honestly doesn't even come close to describing it. She's deep, complicated, emotionally grounded, and her relationship with Rover, what that relationship actually becomes, is something you almost never see handled this well in gacha stories. This isn't fan service, this is something closer to a parent and child bond, and the way that bond shapes Aemeath's final choice, that hit hard. Add to that the number of plot twists layered throughout the story, which is risky on its own, and somehow, instead of collapsing under its own weight, the narrative just keeps getting stronger. Any one of those twists could have felt like too much, but they didn't, because for once the story actually earned them. Now let's take everything that made this update so great and break it down layer by layer, starting with the protagonist. I feel silly mentioning this over and over again, but my god, this was a pleasant surprise. The protagonist speaks, and not just once or in a key scene. Every line is fully voiced. That alone already feels unusual. Not because voicing a protagonist is some radical idea, but because in gacha storytelling, it so often isn't done. From the very first moment of this update, the protagonist isn't just present, they're audible, expressive, and clearly meant to be heard. And right away, that changes how the story feels. But the voice itself isn't the important part, it's what comes with it. In this update, the protagonist isn't just reacting when the plot needs them to, they're actively engaging with what's happening around them. They ask questions, they follow threads of curiosity, they hesitate, they doubt, they process information instead of simply receiving it. And yes, I'm aware how strange it sounds to praise something this basic. Outside of gacha, this would be the bare minimum for any character. not just the protagonist. But within this genre, it's still treated like an exception. That's why it stood out so sharply here, and why, very early on, I had a feeling this update was going to work. As the story unfolds, this becomes even more important because the central narrative isn't just about the world or a distant threat, it's about the relationship between the protagonist and Aemeath. And for that to land, the protagonist has to be an active participant, not a blank surface the story moves across. When something doesn't add up, they don't stay silent. When they're unsure, you can see it, not through exposition dumps, but through tone, expression, and pacing. They don't need to announce distrust outright for you to feel it. And this is where it really clicks. None of this is flashy, none of it is framed as a big moment, it's just consistent, intentional characterization. The kind that quietly builds credibility over time. Yes, there's also a major reveal about who the protagonist actually is. A significant piece of long-running lore finally comes into focus, and it's genuinely compelling. It humanizes them, gives weight to their past, and reframes earlier events in a more personal light. But interestingly, that wasn't the most important change for me. As big as that reveal is, it still mattered less than the simple fact that the protagonist is finally allowed to function like a protagonist, given agency, given perspective, given the space to think and respond as a person rather than a narrative tool. Not just because the story tells you, but because it shows you. It lets you feel the protagonist's agency throughout the entire story. That's how much of a difference this makes in gacha storytelling. And the thing is, as strong as this shift is on its own, it's still only one part of why this update works, because once the protagonist is finally allowed to carry the story properly, the narrative around them is able to do something much more ambitious. Which brings me to the bigger picture, and to how this update finally starts tying together threads that had been rushed, ignored, or left hanging for too long. The more I think about this story, the more I realize why it hit as hard as it did. It's not just that the story is good, it's that the way it's written and the way it's told are finally pulling in the same direction, and that almost never happens in gacha. Most gacha stories start with interesting ideas, strong concepts, good characters, but they're not built first as stories. They're built around the live service structure, around pacing constraints, content drops, banner timing, and because of that there's usually a constant dissonance between the writing and the way the story is presented. You can feel it when a scene wants to linger but can't, when exposition is rushed because the story needs to move on, when twists are introduced not because the narrative is ready but because the update needs a hook. That tension is everywhere in gacha storytelling, but here, it's gone. This update feels like it was written with the confidence that it would be allowed to be told properly. Scenes unfold at the pace they need, information is delivered when it matters, not when it's convenient. The story doesn't hurry past its own ideas and it doesn't stall to over-explain them either. That's why the pacing feels so strong. Yes, there's a lot of exposition here, and normally that would be a problem, but this is exposition that's actually doing work. It's always tied to the character perspective, to immediate stakes, to something that's happening right now. You're not being handed lore for later, you're being given context that deepens the scenes you're already in. That's exposition done right. And then there are the twists. On paper, this update takes a huge risk. Several major turns happen close together. In most stories, especially gacha stories, that would collapse under its own weight. Either the twist will blur together or the impact would be dulled by sheer overload. Instead, every turn lands, not because they're louder or more shocking, but because the story earns them. Each plot twist recontextualizes what comes before, instead of replacing it. You're not confused, you're recalibrating. That constant feeling of, wait, is this actually happening? Doesn't come from cheap surprise. It comes from realizing the story has been one step ahead of you the entire time. And that's the moment where it stopped feeling like a gacha story altogether. This is the kind of writing I'd expect from a well-constructed novel. Something you could take out of the game, put on page and it would still stand on its own. The structure holds, the pacing holds, the emotional logic holds. Everything fits together. Writing, presentation, pacing, character work, in a way that feels deliberate instead of accidental. And once the story reaches that level of cohesion, it can support something truly difficult, a character like Aemeath, because she doesn't work in a story that's barely holding itself together. She only works in a narrative that knows exactly what it's doing, and trusts itself enough to let her exist within it. Aemeath was that one element that sealed this update for me. From the moment she appears, it's obvious that something doesn't quite line up. And that's intentional. The promotional material sets expectations, not in a misleading way, but in a selective one. It gives you just enough to form an image of who she might be, And then the story quietly takes that image apart. Aemeath is immediately different from what she was framed to be, but not in a way that feels like a twist for the sake of surprise. It feels deliberate, purposeful. From her first real scene, there's a sense that she's carrying something the story hasn't shown you yet, something unresolved, something heavy. And instead of rushing to explain that, the narrative lets it sit. As the story progresses, the layers peel back slowly, not through exposition dumps, not through dramatic reveals every 5 minutes, but through accumulation, small moments, reactions, silence, choices. You don't learn who Aemeath is all at once, you realize it. And that's where the relationship with Rover becomes so important. Because this isn't a romance, it never tries to be, and that alone already sets it apart from most gacha character writing. What develops between them is something far rarer in this genre, a parent-child dynamic, built on care, responsibility, protection, and unspoken understanding. It's not idealized, it's not sentimentalized, it's deeply human. Aemeath doesn't orbit Rover as an object of desire. She defines herself through what she feels she owes, what she wants to protect, and what she's willing to sacrifice. And that makes her choices, especially the final one, feel inevitable rather than shocking. Which is why the ending hits the way it does. The story gives you just enough space to believe things might settle. There's a moment where it almost feels like the resolution is going to be gentle, earned, maybe even comforting. And if you're paying attention, that's exactly when the unease starts to creep in. Something doesn't sit right. The story slows down, the tone shifts, and then it happens. That final turn isn't loud, it doesn't rely on spectacle, it hurts because it's consistent, because everything Aemeath is, everything she's been shaped into over the course of the update, leads her there. I cried more than once. Not because the story was trying to make me cry, but because it trusted me to understand what was being told. And that's why Aemeath stands out so much, not just as a well-written character, but as the most human character Wuthering Waves has produced so far. Her arc doesn't exist to sell a banner. It doesn't exist to prop up the protagonist. It exists because the story finally allowed the character to be written without compromise. I've seen writing at this level before, in novels, in carefully constructed long-form stories by established authors. Seeing it here, in a gacha game, is what makes it feel unreal. If Kuro continues writing characters like this, and that's a big if, but one I genuinely hope they commit to, Wuthering Waves could end up setting a new standard for narrative in this genre. Not by abandoning the gacha format, but by proving it doesn't have to limit what kind of stories can be told. When I step back and look at this update as a whole, the biggest takeaway isn't a single reveal, not the protagonist finally being voiced and given real agency, not even Aemeath, as extraordinary as her character and story are. What made this update work is something more fundamental. For the first time, it feels like Wuthering Wave decided to write a story first, and then let the gacha format serve it instead of the other way around. That shift changes everything. It's why the pacing works, it's why the exposition lands instead of dragging, it's why the twists don't feel cheap even when they come close together, it's why the emotional moments feel earned instead of engineered. Whatever the writers changed, the leadership changed, or priorities shifted behind the scenes, something clearly did. The jump from earlier versions of the game to this update isn't incremental, it's structural. The level of story writing and storytelling here isn't just better than what Wuthering Waves has done before, it's several steps above what most gacha games are even trying to do. And yes, I've already seen that not everyone reacted to this update the same way. Some creators and players bounce off it hard. And that's fine, different people engage with stories through different lenses. But from a writing and storytelling perspective, from structure, intent, and execution, this is the most confident Wuthering Waves has ever been. This update doesn't feel like it's testing ideas anymore, it feels like it knows what it wants to be. If Kuro continues writing like this, if they keep trusting their story enough to let it breathe, to take risks, and to prioritize coherence over convenience, Wuthering Waves could genuinely reach a new tier in gacha storytelling. Not because it's darker or louder or more shocking, but because it's simply better constructed. I don't know if they'll keep this momentum. Gacha history doesn't make me overly optimistic. But for the first time with this game, I'm not just curious about what comes next, I'm actually looking forward to it. If you made it this far, thanks for listening, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this kind of long-form story-focused analysis, feel free to like the video or subscribe. I'm planning to do more of this, especially as Wuthering Waves continues to unfold. And if you disagree with my take, that's completely fine too, just keep it civil. This update is interesting precisely because it sparked so many different reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.